so I'm feeling very responsible for that, speaking for the whole of Australia, especially because I'm actually English, so I'm an immigrant into Australia. So with all that in mind, I'm going to go on to talk about autism within Australia. So I guess what I thought I'd do is give a little bit of background. Australia is an interesting place in terms of geography and kind of demographics and those kind of things. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of background on Australia. Talk about kind of Australian autism, or the perception that I have around that. But focus on, we have this big government initiative at the moment of cooperative research centres, and they're worth millions and millions of dollars that the government put in. And there's a big one that's been operating for probably about 4 years now. They've got another 4 years left, and this is the Autism CRC. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that the Autism CRC are doing. And then I'll finish off by talking about critical Australian autism, which will be very brief. It's very different to the Swedish context. So that's kind of where I'm headed. Okay, so a little bit of background. As I'm sure you all know, Australia is huge. I live just a little bit inland from Brisbane in Queensland. So it's made up of a whole federation of states and territories, with 6 states, 2 territories. Now the majority of us live in the southeast corner. So the bit between Adelaide and Brisbane, that's where pretty much everyone lives. So going west of that, hardly anyone lives in the massive third over in Western Australia. Everyone is very kind of focused around that bottom corner. There's lots of different powers between the states and territories in terms of policy making. So we see some federal laws, some are operated at state level. So for example, it wasn't until 2010 that we had a national registration of psychologists. So each of them were licensed per state or territory and could then practice in the various different states and territories other than the one that they were licensed in. So it's only recently that we've seen a kind of a national framework in terms of registration of people like psychologists. We do have some national health care, with Medicare, but the majority of individuals living within Australia would have some kind of private health cover, and that's just a typical expectation as opposed to being something quite kind of discreet and unique as it would be in the UK, for example. So despite it being a massive country, the majority of it is empty. So we've just tipped over the number into 24 million people, so we're quite excited about that. We've made 24 million in the whole of Australia. And of this 24 million, 6.7 million of us are born overseas, so 28% of the population are immigrants. So it's a really kind of interesting mix, I guess, within Australia. So it's such a big place, it's all squashed in that bottom corner, which is interesting in itself. Okay, so in terms of a really kind of brief overview around what autism within Australia looks like, typically in terms of powers around diagnosis is typically the privilege of paediatricians, psychiatrists, or a clinical psychologist in some states. Okay, so even though we now have a national registration, for states other than Queensland, clinical psychologists can give a diagnosis. Within Queensland, clinical psychologists can only work in consultation with paediatricians unless the person with autism is an adult, in which case clinical psychs can diagnose anyway. So there's a few different levels in terms of who can diagnose and when and under what kind of circumstances. Now, in terms of the kind of dominant narrative within Australia, it's very different to the Swedish context that Hannah's just presented. It's very much focused around the medical model. We're seeing a much more increase in terms of narrative around personal experience, but that's still very much kind of marginal in terms of the kind of dominant ideas. In terms of kind of self-advocacy, I guess the political kind of advocacy that Hannah was referring to in terms of organised movements and kind of challenges to bigger kind of policies is very much in its early days. So we don't really see that kind of organised advocacy within Australia that kind of gains big momentum. so very much in terms of the early days. But in terms of autism in Australia and kind of government policy, we're seeing some huge changes that are going to start taking effect, over the next few years. And the big kind of change at the moment is the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme that's due to roll out across Australia-wide on the 1st of July this year. So the idea is that its aim ultimately is to try and increase control and choice in terms of the supports that are received by individuals. In terms of what that looks like at the moment, considering it's due to be rolled out in 2 weeks' time, the actual reality for this at the moment is complete confusion as to how this is going to work and how families might organise their priorities and ultimately how that's going to work in terms of the huge geography. So if you're living in Sydney or Adelaide or Melbourne, then access to your kind of preferred supports and put together your package will be far more easily achievable than if you're living, 300 k's west of Brisbane, where there probably is only one psychologist that flies into town once a week. So how that kind of NDIS is going to eventually roll out will be quite interesting to see. But in terms of autism, the NDIS is going to be incredibly influential because in terms of autism as a diagnosis, it forms 31% of NDIS participants. So they're a third of the population that are going to fit underneath this new insurance scheme umbrella. So what we're starting to see is certainly a real increase in terms of focusing in terms of both research and policy. So for example, in Education Queensland, which is the state that I live in, they've just launched this multi-million-dollar autism hub that's supposed to focus research and policy around education practices and all of those kind of ideas, specifically focused around autism. And I think we're going to see more of that as the kind of NDIS rolls out. Now, our big kind of national survey that we have every 4 years, the kind of census, it happened in 2015. We just had an early release of that, but it's only quite raw data at the moment. So we're kind of working on the 2012 release in a moment. So the 2012 survey of disability, ageing and carers from the Australian Bureau of Statistics tells us some quite interesting things. So we know, for example, that as of 2012, there were just over 115,000 autistic Australians, so that's kind of the population within Australia that we're focusing on. And within this population, we know that they're repeatedly reporting challenges in a whole series of areas. So the big kind of area of challenge that they're reporting is around restrictions in education. So, 86% are having difficulties in accessing education. And this could be a geographical challenge in terms of where you live. So a lot of the towns out west just don't have high schools. So families have the choice of relocating to the city, sending their children to boarding school, those kind of options. If your child's got autism, that obviously presents further layers to those kind of discussions as to what's going to happen. So restrictions in education are a really core problem. The other reported issues are around participation in the labour force, and the census told us that only 42% of adults with autism are actually participating in the labour force, compared to 53% of people with disabilities more generally and 83% of people without disabilities. So the overall picture that comes back to us from the consensus is one of struggling economic participation, lower levels of education, and lower levels of labour force participation. So there's some key challenges that happen. So the Autism CRC, which I alluded to, is a national research collaboration that brings in government, university, not-for-profits, self-advocates. It's supposed to be kind of an all-encompassing kind of organisation of research. And it's one that crosses Australia-wide. So there's various different partners across all the states and territories, and they've worked really hard to make sure that they've got that kind of representation. Now, the Autism CRC describes itself as the world's first national research effort focused on autism across the lifespan, working together with the autism community to provide the evidence base to support individuals on the spectrum throughout their lives. So it's got really big ambitions in terms of its focus and what its kind of projects are that it aligns to. So it's certainly got a strong agenda on prioritising the voice of people with autism within research practices, and they've been very strategic in terms of the makeup of their board that overlooks the CRC. So we see some adults with autism members of the board. There's also parents of adults with autism, as well as psychologists and OTs, and all the other kind of professionals that might be working with adults with autism, as well as researchers. So there's lots of kind of different buy-in into what the CRC looks like. Now, for today, what I found interesting about the CRC work was that they've recently undertaken a national project to look at the different kind of diagnostic practices and services delivery across Australia. So they were quite interested in how do people become diagnosed with autism in Australia, and what does that look like as a kind of a national kind of pattern. What some of the things that they found were quite interesting. You can access the full report if you want to, but I've summarised into 3 bullet points what is a 40-page report, so hopefully I'll do justice. But one of the things that was really interesting was that they highlighted some real differences between the public and the private sector in terms of how assessments are made, how the referrals pan out, and what that kind of frequency of diagnosis looks like. So, for example, if people go through the public system, through the Medicare system, then individuals are much more likely to be seen within multidisciplinary teams. They're very rarely seen by a single clinician. Whereas in the private sector, there's rarely any collaboration in terms of making a diagnostic decision. And the individual private practitioner will see the child or adult, and they will make a diagnosis based on that individual. So no collaboration between other individuals within the private sector, but much more multidisciplinary teamwork within the public sector. Interestingly, if you go to a private clinician in Australia, you're much more likely to receive an autism diagnosis than you would do if you went through the public system. A small number of clinicians in the report, responding to their report, reported actually giving an autism diagnosis when the individual didn't quite meet all the criteria to ensure that the individual would have access to the interventions and support services that the clinician felt that this individual would benefit from and would need. So there's some quite interesting differences happening between the public and the private sectors. In terms of where the assessments take place, they traditionally take place in clinics, so very little looking at the kind of contextual stuff, going to visit people at home. It tends to be within that kind of private clinic setting. A third of the clinicians reported not using any measures of development, cognition, language, any of those kind of things in the assessments they were making, and ultimately the diagnoses that they were providing. And I guess for individuals weighing up whether to go through the public or the private system, there's no cost within the public sector, but the wait times can be incredibly lengthy. Whereas in the private sector, you can see someone incredibly quickly, but you're looking at up to $2,500 to $3,000 in order to receive that diagnosis. So there's some quite interesting patterns that are emerging across the private public sector, and also the way that clinicians are coming to a decision, I guess, around the diagnosis. Okay, so critical Australian autism. I did say this slide would be very brief. It's developing, I think, is the answer. Australian psychology, I'm based in psychology. Australian psychology is very, very conservative. So, for example, they don't even teach any qualitative research methods until students get to 4th year. So it's a very conservative profession and a very conservative discipline within Australia. So research around autism tends to be dominated by medical model approaches. And there seems to be little space at the moment for more competing presentations and understandings. But we do know that self-advocacy movements are becoming more visible, but the narratives that are taken up by the movements tend to be that of North America, UK. There doesn't seem to be a kind of an Australian narrative, certainly in the same way that I have described the more kind of Swedish narrative. The other kind of big absence within Australian voices around autism is the complete absence of Indigenous Australian perspective. So we never really hear about anything around an Indigenous kind of perspective on autism. Picking up on Lindsay's earlier comments around terminology, well, terminology is a really interesting thing, and the terms that Lindsay was using, such as NT and neurodiversity, all of that kind of stuff, is not particularly common within Australia. And we know that it's very common within the UK, it slips into clinical practice, and it seems to be a well-understood kind of term. So there's a few times when I've written on things for Australian colleagues, you know, autism this, NT this, and they'll come back and say, what does that mean? That's not common understanding, that's not common language. So NT and neurodiversity are particularly common. And just to kind of illustrate this, one of my graduate students over the summer did a Google Scholar systematic search to find out exactly where these terms are going to be used. It's something that we're going to be investigating in more detail. But certainly the UK is the one that completely dominates this kind of research narrative. The 5 from Brazil are pretty much all Francisco. so it's not necessarily representative of the whole of Brazil. But it's quite interesting that these terms don't seem to be travelling, and they particularly don't travel well to Australia. But I anticipate that this will potentially change. So just to kind of summarise a little bit, in terms of the dominant kind of idea, it's very much around the medical gaze. It's very much around interventions that focus on changing and fitting in and those kind of ideals. In terms of therapy, it's very much dominated, as is the rest of psychology, by cognitive behavioural therapy and certainly clinical psychology ideas. And while I think we are seeing an increased profile in terms of self-advocacy movements, they're yet to be at the forefront of this kind of agitation for change. So we're seeing them very much in their kind of infancy. And certainly I think we're seeing some really positive, broader developments, particularly with the CRC agenda and those kind of bigger organisations that have got the potential to kind of agitate for change. But even within the CRC, it's much more around kind of participatory research, making research kind of accessible, those kind of things, rather than it being kind of more emancipatory research that's kind of, you know, contesting some of the bigger kind of ideas and focusing around these kind of constructions of identities. But I suspect